Welcome to the Collecting the Past podcast. Funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and in partnership with the Flannery O'Connor Institute for the Humanities, this project paired students from Georgia College with community members to collect oral histories from individuals who either lived in Milledgeville during the heart of O'Connor's writing career or whose lives were shaped by events that took place during this period. Our goals with the project are to expand the existing historical narrative of our town by documenting unwritten life stories and creating a public digital archive. As you'll hear, the students had fun creating their own podcasts in the style of their choice. Like our narrators, each episode has its own personality.
Dawson Cowart here with Dr. Gwynedd Webster, and Audrey Burney is recording for us today.
Hi, Audrey.
Hello.
So my first question is, what can you tell me about your experience growing up in Milledgeville?
Okay. Well, I didn't move here until I was about 4 years old. I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where my parents were from. And my father had taken a job shortly after World War II with a company down in Dublin. He was working for J.P. Stevens, a textile company at the time. And so after I was born, very shortly after I was born, my parents moved down to Dublin, and they were getting pretty well established. And then suddenly the Stevens company moved my father to Milledgeville, to the branch of their company here, which is out on, I think it's US 21. You may have seen the old Stevens plant out there. If you know where the old state prison used to be before they knocked it down, it's right across the street from there. But at any rate, I moved here at 4, and I started kindergarten at Mrs. Roberts' kindergarten when I was 4.5 or something like that. So they just basically threw me into school a little early, and then from there, when I graduated, I entered first grade at City Elementary, and I was still 5 at the time. So I went through City Elementary, the 1st through 7th grades, and trying to get our dates right here. So we moved in 1956, and I would have entered the first grade then in about 57, and I stayed at City Elementary until the 12th grade. So in 1964, I had done fairly well in school, so they entered me into Baldwin High School in what they call the accelerated program. The other name for that was the Latin algebra program. So they started us in the accelerated program at the 8th grade. I didn't go to a middle school at all, and I went to Baldwin High 8th through 12th grades. It was a curriculum that included, as I said, a foundation in Latin. They started out the math with algebra, and it proceeded from there by 10th grade into geometry. The 11th grade went into trigonometry, and the 12th grade we had pre-calculus and calculus. So we had advanced science courses, and we had some really good science teachers, included Mrs. Horn. Mr. Simpson taught us biology. He was a lot of fun. And we had a course in physics that was taught by Mr. Dunn, Clyde Dunn. And of all those courses, I absolutely adored physics the most. I really that was my favorite course I ever took at Baldwin High. And so that prepared me to go to Georgia Tech. And so from Milledgeville, I moved to Atlanta at age 17, and then I entered Georgia Tech and got through and graduated from there. Now, specific questions about Milledgeville, maybe you could kind of help me in knowing what you're looking for.
Yes, ma'am, I can, of course. Yeah. Uh, so I was going to save the more Milledgeville specific questions for the second
Oh,
half.
okay.
And
Well, let's just wait right there then. Um, as far as uh, my time growing up in Milledgeville, um, I was a nerd from the beginning. Um, Nerds don't fit in with the active and socially more uh, involved crowd. We always had a clique of fellow nerds that we would hang around with, and so um, I guess I was not a real socialized or sociable person all the way through that period of time, and was not really a loner, but pretty close to it and eccentric. Um, I enjoyed riding my bicycle around town. I did a lot of exploring around town, and then in Carrington Woods, where I lived, on the bicycle. Um, One of the things I eventually did by the time I was, I guess, in about the sixth grade, seventh grade, I would ride back and forth to the library. And at that time, the library had recently moved from its original location to um, the Mary Vinson Memorial Library, which was the old post office building. And you may recognize that it's on the corner of Hancock and I believe Wilkinson Street. Um, and it was, gosh, it was just a beautiful building. You'd go in there and it had this rich old wood smell to it, like an older post office, but it also had that nice book smell to it. And I could get lost in there. Um, so I would spend a lot of time in the library. Um, and sometimes I'd go shopping downtown. We had small shops then. There was nothing that existed here or in Milledgeville that was anything close to um, Walmart or the more modern kinds of Walgreens, CVS, and that sort of thing. We had what we call variety stores, or the local vernacular was dime stores. And so we had Chandler's and we had Rose's, and you can still see the name Rose's downtown on Wayne Street on that one there. Um, and they were kind of homey and easy and enjoyable to go along and look at different things in there. And as I got more and more advanced into nerddom, I I got very interested in stuff that engineers and scientists interested in, and I began the process of making models, like model aircraft and model ships and things like that. And so I would buy a lot of them. We had a program where at school it was 25 cents per meal for lunch, but you didn't have to spend your lunch money. And so I would save it up, and at the end of the week, I'd go down to um, Chandler's or Rose's or somewhere, and I'd buy a model of something, and it would only cost 79 cents back in those days. I mean, these days they're like $10 and $15 and more. Or so I put those together. But the main thing I did was I never bought anything like that unless I had read books about them. And I got extremely interested. I loved space. Before we ever had a space program, I was reading science fiction about space. I read history, and I loved the history of aviation and those sorts of things. So I got fascinated by old antique aviation and began to be very interested in World War One because my grandfather was in World War One, and he would tell me stories about it. And so I would buy model planes from that era, try to paint them up like some of the more famous aviators and things like that. Um, but the thing was, you could just walk through town. Uh, there was never any danger. You would walk through. Chandler's was more or less across the street from what used to be the campus theater, which is now, I believe, the Georgia College Bookstore. And so that was pretty typical of a day when well, I didn't have school. I'd ride my bike over to the library, spend some time over there. Didn't even have to lock it up. You wouldn't have your bicycle stolen, and so I would just go downtown and would probably buy a model airplane, and I might even stop in and see a movie if I checked in with my parents. And um, it was just a fun place to grow up in a lot of ways, and um, it was those parts of growing up in Milledgeville were great. The parts of not growing up in Milledgeville that were not great at growing up in Milledgeville were some of the things that were expected, and you're expected to go into sports programs and things like that, and I was never good in sport.
Mm. I think we lost you, Dr. Webster. Can you still hear me? Um, let me see. Oh dear. Let me send her another link to join.
Yeah, that was kind of she had like it sounded like she had perfect, like decent service. I don't know what went on. Do you want me to stop the recording and then start another one?
You can, yeah. Well, no, just keep it going, I guess, because
Okay,
that way you don't have like 20 things.
sounds good.
All right, can you hear me yet?
Oh, you're back. Yes, I can. I was just about to send you
Let's
another
try
link
to
to join.
hear that.
Your screen froze. I got a little worried for a second there. That
Yeah. All right, hold on. I wear hearing aids, so I've got to take my hearing aids out in order for this to work. My research for many years was in bulletproof and bomb-proof materials. So I lost my hearing from a lot of gunshots and explosions, and I wear hearing aids now. So you can hear me now?
yes, I can. Can you hear us? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I guess maybe the built-in microphone must have failed or something. But
Yep.
I'm not sure where I was. I think we're going back talking about sports and kind of enforced participation in sports and things like that, which was a terrible pain. Um, and one of the things that was it's an unpleasant memory about growing up in Milledgeville then, but it was extremely segregated. Integration was just fought tooth and nail. And Bonner Park had been donated by a former Confederate officer, and he had specified that there were never to be any black people who could participate down there. I mean, I was young. I didn't know that much about it. I knew that there was a big swimming pool that was next to the recreation area. And I would go down and, we could go swimming there and so forth, but only white people could go swimming. And um, when we finally had integration, there was such a fuss about it that they actually closed the swimming pool and filled it in with dirt and paved it over, and it's no longer there. Um, one of the clear memories that I have of the place, not not really being aware of the problems with segregation and integration and so forth, was being down at the baseball and softball field, and you could hear the jukebox from Bonner Park that was playing, and I have this memory of Del Shannon's Little Runaway playing. And if you've never heard it, please go get on Spotify or something and play Del Shannon's Little Runaway. It's a very, very early 60s kind of song with the heavy electric guitars, and Del Shannon had uh, a really high-pitched voice. And so he would sing that, and it was it was a fun song. It's one of those earworm kind of songs once you hear it. Uh, many, many years later, Michael Mann made a TV series, and that was the theme to it. It was called Crime Story, about some policemen in Las Vegas. So um, that's one of the clearer memories I have. Uh, one of the other odd things, and I don't want to ramble on, but just thinking about some things that were unique that Milledgeville had that you just didn't have anywhere else. We had the largest mental institution in the non-communist world. And so, of course, it was south of town. And it was not unusual for uh, some of the less dangerous patients down there to come into town and go shopping and so forth. Um, so you would see them come in every now and then, but you really didn't mix with them because for a really young person, like 5 to 10 years old, it was an uncomfortable feeling. You would talk about people who would have odd body motions or mumble to themselves or talk to people that weren't there and things like that. And so it was a very odd sensation, but they were not dangerous. They were just intermingling in normal society. Um, and that was something that you just didn't get anywhere else. Um, when you think about what was it like to grow up in Milledgeville, I guess the most enduring memory was it was hot. It was so hot, and it wasn't uh, generally um, air conditioned in different places. Our house wasn't air conditioned until the end of the 60s. Um, and there were stores that weren't air conditioned. You would go in and there were just ceiling fans going around. That was it. Um, Kids would often go barefoot. And wow, I can't describe to you what it's like trying to walk across an asphalt street in 100-degree weather barefoot. But you didn't spend much time on the street, I'll tell you that. Um, it was very unpleasant. Um, I will say this, I do have some memories of also being in Dublin, because I was between, 1 and 3 years old in Dublin, but there weren't the huge amounts of bugs in Milledgeville like there were in Dublin. I remember walking down the sidewalk with some of the little kids in Dublin and having to go down the sidewalk swatting gnats in front of my face. because otherwise they would just jump all over your face. But it wasn't like that in Milledgeville. It was much more pleasant. Um, Milledgeville had pollen and pine straw. And that's the thing that you could always remember about what fall in particular was like in Milledgeville. You would have to rake up pine straw, and you had to watch out for the yellow jacket wasps that were all around because they'd swarm up and get you. In the spring, everything was covered with pollen. Mom and Dad would make me go out and sweep just the walkway up to the house and maybe even sweep the driveway. And yeah, that was horrible. You sweep, and the pollen would get all in the air, and it would get in your eyes and everywhere else. So that's something about Milledgeville that's hard to forget. Um, I'm actually writing some stuff, a memoir about my life back then. And one of the things I remember was my dad brought me in one time, knowing that I was a nerd and knowing that I was pretty good in math and science, and I didn't want to spend my life writing poetry or doing paintings. Um, and he said, there's one thing you need to consider. You're talking about having to go to high school, and you're talking about where you're going for the rest of your life, and you like airplanes, and you like science. So I don't want you to go to the University of Georgia. That was just not socially acceptable, by the way, that everybody had to be University of Georgia fans because, it was just the thing, and you had to go around wearing red and Bulldogs and so forth. And he says, but you're going to Georgia Tech. And that was a world-changing experience because I said, I never really thought about that, and so I decided by the time I guess I was in the 8th grade, I better start learning about what this place was like called Georgia Tech. And so one day in the fall, I was raking pine straw, and we had these wonderful brand new devices that had just come out in about 1962, 63, and they were about this big, and they had these collapsible antennas on them. They were called transistor radios. And the only way you could listen by yourself without disturbing anybody was pretty much what I have now, just a little earbud connected to a wire. And so I was out raking my pine straw in the fall and trying to say, well, okay, everybody likes football in the South, and all around here is nothing but Georgia. So I'm trying to tune around and find out what this is all about. And you get WMAZ, which is over in Macon, and it's just blasting out University of Georgia game. And I'm trying to tune around, and all of a sudden there's this little tiny weak station, 920 WGST. And GST stood for Georgia School of Technology. And it was right on the campus of Georgia Tech, and it wasn't really very strong in Milledgeville. So I tuned into this thing, and you could hear their announcer, who was so different from Larry Munson, the University of Georgia announcer. And his name was Al Ciraldo, and he had this really strange cadence. And I'm listening to it, and he talks like this, Georgia Tech, gotta kick the ball. And it was so weird. You could always hear who he was when you would tune around. So I started listening to it. And lo and behold, as I'm raking the pine straw, this yellow jacket flies up at me. And I'm raking it, and she lands right on my finger. And I said, oh, okay, well, you're a yellow jacket, and I'm supposed to become a yellow jacket, so don't sting me. And so I just stayed perfectly still. And you know how they are. They'll wiggle their stingers, and they'll do their antennae, and they'll flap their wings and so forth. But you just stay still. And I said, fly away, sister. Yes, she did. She flew away. But it was an interesting, brand new experience. And it's sort of addictive. I was always the standout anyway. I was weird. I didn't blend in. And now I doubly didn't blend in because I'm not wearing red and black and pulling for the Bulldogs. I'm having to wear yellow and red and white and pull for a swarm of wasps. And so it became one of the other socially unacceptable things to do. Um, and that was kind of what it was like for a social outcast there. Um, Now, one of the other things that was interesting, I had a brother. He passed away back in uh, 2016. Um, but he was younger than me, and um, he he was very much into the civil rights movement and was he had a band that he played with. It was a rock band. He played string bass. He played the string bass in the Baldwin High School band, played electric bass. Um, and so he was more involved in things like the civil rights movement. And that caused him some specific problems. I wasn't aware, but he told me later in life that he'd gone into the boys' bathroom at Baldwin High School and he was threatened with a knife in there because he had actually participated in a civil rights parade. Um, we were quite different in that sense because I was just involved in academics. I was involved in what I wanted to do and set my mind on certain goals and didn't get involved in things like that. I was in high school, I was a part of the science club, a part of the beta club, and those were the sorts of things that I did. I did not get involved um, in chorus or I didn't get involved in any of the plays or anything like that. I did play in the band. I was a member of the band at City Elementary. I was a member all the way through to senior year in Baldwin High School. And it was an interesting, very interesting experience. Um, Often rewarding, often not. But I played the sousaphone, which is the big bass horn that you wrap around yourself, which which made you a target. And I'll never forget that during one of the things we did at Baldwin High School, um, there was a man who wanted to have a fundraiser to fight cancer because he had overcome colorectal cancer. And we had a, a march, a parade in Milledgeville in support of this. And I was marching by the area where it must be Green Street. It's been a long time. I haven't lived in Milledgeville since 1974. So anyway, we were walking by GMC over there, and there was a boy that came up and shot a pea shooter at my horn, but he missed, and he hit me in the right eye with whatever he was shooting. And I was very fortunate at the time that I was wearing hard contact lenses, and it hit the contact and knocked it out, but it left a scar on my right eye. Um, and this wasn't very unusual either during my upbringing in Milledgeville. You had some really rough guys. What people worry about now, they worry about minority gangs and things like that. But we had what we used to call hoodlums. And, we had some really rough people who were in those types of where they were gangs. And they would do things like that just to cause mischief on purpose. And so I did get hit in the eye. but I was in a parade and I continued marching with one contact out and one eye really hurting. And we finished the parade, but it caused me some problems later. Um, and I developed a cataract on that eye that I finally got surgically repaired. In fact, I've had both eyes surgically repaired for cataracts. Um, and that's one of the worst memories of growing up in that area. All right.
So I know that you lived in Dublin and some other places. How did living in other cities shape your perception of Milledgeville?
Okay. Well, obviously, going to Georgia Tech, I was in Atlanta, and that was a very different environment than living in Milledgeville. Um, I I really enjoyed Atlanta, and of course, my parents were from Charlotte, so I would go up to Charlotte and meet with my grandparents and aunts and uncles up there. So I learned the difference between urban and rural or small town environments, and I became a lot more um, amenable to the urban types of environments. It was more fun, in other words, to live in a city than to live in a very small town. But the small town, of course, had its strong advantages. Um, in those days in Milledgeville, you didn't really worry too much about serious crime. Um, you did in Atlanta. I had friends and classmates who were robbed at gunpoint. Uh, when I went back to Georgia Tech after being out in industry a short time, I went to get my master's degree there, and crime had gotten considerably worse. And of course, as a graduate student, you spend a lot of time doing research um, in the late hours. And during that period of time, there was actually a slasher on campus who was specifically targeting foreign students and women. And I guess I won't get arrested for saying this, but uh, I started carrying a gun with me. And so I'd go out at like 2 in the morning to get to my car, which you had to park quite a distance away from any building on campus at Georgia Tech. And some of the areas were pretty dark. And so you started unconsciously learning things like combat techniques where you would walk through a parking lot where there were no cars at all parked. So you had 360-degree vision um, and go to your car from there. Uh, you never had that problem in Milledgeville. There was one point where on a kind of cold fall night, it was raining, and I walked up, and I didn't drive that day. I took MARTA, and I walked up to where the bus stop was at MARTA, and it was under a street light, but just standing there, I had this creepy feeling that something wasn't quite right, and I turned around, and there was a young black fellow who was probably on drugs. He had very bloodshot red eyes, and his face was about 3 inches from my face when I turned around, and he was startled. And I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "You want to give me $1?" And I thought, "No." And I just answered instinctively, and I wondered how quickly I could bring my briefcase up the chin level if he decided to attack me, but he was so drugged out he didn't. But you never had that in Milledgeville, you know? Um, I understand that there is a crime problem there now to some extent, but probably not like that. Big difference in perception.
Definitely. Um, so when you were exploring Milledgeville
Mhm.
on your bike, did you ever find anything like super out of the way, like something that you feel like no one else had discovered before? Or were there
I wouldn't say that, but there were places that I like to frequent that other people didn't. Um, in Carrington Woods, we had a place that everybody there called the Cliff. It's been allowed to overgrow and is now just kind of nondescript, but it used to be a raw bare wall, uh, made out of sandstone and red clay. And you would, if you were very adventurous, you would try to climb that bare wall, which I'm a little crazy, so I did that. I eventually learned how to climb it all the way to the top, and I would just stand there a lot of times just alone because it was comfortable to be alone a lot of times. And one of the things that I would do, my father had given me a pair of binoculars one year, and I would take those binoculars and just look around at the sky or look, out in the distance. And uh, I remember being able to see all the way over toward the state hospital area with those binoculars from there. And it was very, very interesting. Uh, and of course, I love to watch when airplanes went over and try to see what kind of planes they were. And, uh, it was a nice feeling. Um, the only other real thing that was kind of odd, I guess, I would ride my bicycle back into paths off the paved roads, and I must have been in about the seventh, maybe eighth grade, and I went down one path and found a really nice patch of persimmons. So I don't know whose they were, but I gathered up a bunch of persimmons and took them home. Um, but yeah, I would go down and basically explore. Uh, I went down to one section in the back of Carrington Woods, and I don't remember the name of the street anymore, but it dead ended in a patch of woods there, and I sort of pushed my bike down into that area. There was a stream, and I was looking around in the stream, and there were crawfish down in there. So that was cool. Uh, that's the kind of thing that really fascinated nature fascinated me more than anything else.
Did you spend any time at the Oconee River area as well?
Not too much. The Oconee River was kind of far from where I lived, other than um, sometimes we would go out to the Sinclair Dam and look at it. And, that's sort of the headwaters from Milledgeville of the Oconee after dammed up Lake Sinclair, and just sort of look at that, and then you could follow it down. But there was a time uh, in January, late December and January of probably 1963, 64, I'm guessing. But we had a huge rain. It was absolutely flooding everything. And Lake Sinclair had to open up all of the flues on the dam in order to uh, keep the dam from breaking. It had flooded Carrington Woods. My dad took the family up to what was then the John Millage Motel. It stands where the current new, I think it's county office building on North Columbia is. And so we spent the night there because everything in Carrington Woods was flooded. And Milledgeville itself was flooding because of the Oconee River. That's unforgettable.
That sounds unforgettable. I didn't know that Milledgeville flooded like that.
Yeah, it did that time. I don't know what the deal was. The only other real natural disaster that I can remember, our family was in the Methodist church, and so we went to, or my brother and I went to one of those. What was it? I can't remember the initials for it. United Methodist Youth, and MYF. That's what it was. We went to a meeting of them, and that night was unbelievably cold. And we got through with the meeting, and several of us who were in the band together were walking down the street next to the Methodist church, and we could see the clock down there on East Hancock Street, and it was flashing 0 as the temperature. Um, and I'd never seen it hit 0 before in Milledgeville. And the next night, or that night maybe, the temperature suddenly changed. A warm front moved through, and there was a tornado, and it went right through the middle of town. I remember it damaged some houses on North Columbia, or excuse me, South Columbia Street, and it, tore some roofs up over on Hancock Street and that sort of thing. Um, but that was kind of fascinating. I'd never seen the effects of a real tornado until then.
That is, the tornadoes are terrifying.
Oh yeah, they really are.
I'm gonna jump off of that story and ask you more about religion, and if you would like to talk about going to church back then
Yeah.
with your family and the people that you
Okay.
met and went with.
Okay. It was pretty much expected that you had to go to church. Um, and so we went to Sunday school most of the time at the Methodist Church. And I guess you know where the old United Methodist Church was located, across the street um, from the Georgia College campus. Um, and so we would go to the Sunday school meetings, and then after that, we'd have to meet up. My brother and I would go meet up with my mom and dad, and we'd go sit at the church service in the sanctuary, and you would listen to one of the Methodist ministers give a sermon. And most of the time it was like, okay, whatever. But what became more interesting to me later in life was that a lot of our ministers, especially the younger ones, were educated at Emory. And they were bringing us interesting ideas, what the older folks thought were radical and heretical or whatever, but uh, they were interested in social change, and they would talk about the possibilities of integration, and they were talking about the suppression of Black people as opposed to what we thought was normal for white people. And it made a lot of the white people extremely uncomfortable. I didn't really see the implications of it until I got older, got out into college and so forth. But I think the Methodist Church at that time was a very progressive church and was interested in social change. And I think it had a heavy effect on me. Um, Later in life, um, I became a Lutheran. Uh, my maternal grandmother was a Lutheran, and I was very interested in learning German, so it was a natural transition for me. And we would go to, services, and especially at Christmas, they would have all German services, which was interesting. Um, when I was at Auburn, I left the Lutheran church. It was getting, well, we had one particular Lutheran pastor who was kind of flaky. Um, and around the time that my father died, he was preaching something that he had read uh, from a young minister from Notre Dame, and said that no person could be a Christian and also be a member of the military. And that upset me quite a bit because my father had been a veteran of World War II, and he had actually fought in uh, the Normandy hedgerow battles, and he had been wounded during World War II. And I thought, this upsets me. And I joined the Episcopal Church at that time. So I've been what a lot of fundamentalists would think of as a liberal, but I have been a Christian. And so church and religion has been important to me because of the upbringing in Milledgeville because of my family background and so forth. But the whole time I was in Milledgeville, I was a Methodist.
So when you got married and started your own family, did you have them go to Episcopal church, or was that in the middle of?
And at first, it was Lutheran, um, and I have one son, and he became more of an agnostic, um, and just actually stopped going to church about the time that he was finishing high school. Um, but I, um, I did remain in the Episcopal Church and have enjoyed being in the Episcopal Church. I find it to be intellectually stimulating. I also like the tradition of it. I guess that's the reason I liked both the Episcopal and the Lutheran faiths, because they have their roots back in the Renaissance times, and I like the tradition and the rituals and the liturgy of them, and I find the more unstructured um, evangelical churches to be a little bit more chaotic, so I don't attend them.
Did you learn about those in your literature when you were at the library here, or was that like something later on? What kinds of things would you, or what types of history and space books would you get from the library here? What was
Oh, okay.
available?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, Most of the history that I read for a long time was more recent histories, what was going on in the 20th century, um, and the 19th century to a certain extent. You know, if you grew up in Milledgeville, you've got to be influenced by Civil War history, because obviously Milledgeville was the capital of Georgia during that period of time. So I was interested in that. Um, but there was a point in probably the sixth grade, and we were studying medieval history. And I became fascinated with what that was like, and uh, castles and knights. And I read Ivanhoe and some of the other, stories about Robin Hood and so forth. And it fascinated me. Um, And as I learned more about that, you could see the influence of churches. Some of it was funny. When you read Robin Hood, obviously Friar Tuck was a funny guy, a drunk who was also a monk, the drunk monk, okay? And so he was kind of a caricature, but you begin to learn later that there were a lot of really uh, strong influences, good and bad, during the Middle Ages by the church. Um, and then when I was reading about some of the influences during the Reformation, and you read what was going on during the Spanish Inquisition, nobody expected it, but the the Spanish Inquisition, was horrifying. Uh, Later, when I was working for a Swiss company, I would go through real castles, and they would show me some of the torture devices that were used on unbelievers. And I would have some of my colleagues that I worked with from Switzerland who would show me things like how they would put your hand in these devices where you couldn't move them, and they would cut off a finger one at a time. And just absolutely brutal, unbelievable cruelty. And it turned my stomach. Um, I was I was ready to take a break from churches for a while after that. But at the same time, I was a Lutheran then, and I could see those characters as heroes because they're breaking away from um, this kind of unusual cruelty, until you find out that Martin Luther and John Calvin burned people alive. So then you realize, okay, some of the stuff that that you're supposed to be following. Just love one another and treat one another the way you'd want to be treated. That only applies if you don't want to burn burn them alive or cut their fingers off. So, yeah, it causes a conflict.
That's very true. So what would you and your family do outside of church together? Were there any like big things that were done together, like games, dinners, movies, things like that?
Movies, yes. Sometimes we would have company over for parties, um, and try to cook unusual things, duck à l'orange, and so some specialty dishes like that. And I was very fond because I was working for the Swiss. I was very fond of Germanic kinds of foods. I developed a real. Oh, wait a minute! I have just lost you. Let me see if I can find you again. There you are. Okay. Uh, I would like to fix things like the German Wurst, and then learn to fix German style salad, and potatoes, potato salads and things like that. Um, a lot of times we would have company over, but we also would go and visit with people that I worked with. Um, and I guess I took my son to interesting places. When I finally got to graduate school, and I was in Clemson for a PhD, I took him one time down to the Riverbank Zoo in Columbia, and he really enjoyed that until we got to see the bears. And he had watched Disney's The Fox and the Hound, and he was terrified of bears. Um, so we saw this one bear that I thought was just kind of cute, innocuous. It like it had little spectacles on it. It was something they had in South America. And I said, "See, that's a bear. Are you scared?" And he looks at me and he says, "Yes." So I thought, okay, well, that was a bust. That didn't work out. Um, but at any rate, those were the kinds of things I loved to do. Uh, yeah, I like to tell funny stories when I was teaching too. But at any rate, he did enjoy that sort of thing. He also enjoyed sitting on the back of my bicycle when I would ride it. I had a child seat mounted on the back of my bicycle, and particularly when I was going to Clemson, I'd mount that on there and ride him around the campus. And Clemson had a wonderful area, their dairy products area. And I would take him over there and would get him some ice cream that was from the cows that were raised on campus there. And then they made the ice cream formula themselves, and he'd love to go down there to get ice cream cones and things like that, or go down and play in the park. And we went to some of their football games together because that they have this wonderful area that's just an unfinished bank, and you could sit on the grass. And it was they let kids in for free back then. Nobody does that anymore, but uh, they would let you take a child in for free. And I would take him to a football game, and he would watch the people cheer, and it was close to running down the hill. If you're familiar with Clemson, they have this tradition of running down the hill right before the game, and we could see them run down the hill and rub Howard's Rock, which was a rock that came in from Death Valley. They call the stadium Death Valley, and so he would see the players up close. And this was back in the days of Danny Ford, shortly after their first national championship. And so he enjoyed the pageantry of it. He just didn't take a kid to see Georgia Tech. Who wants to go see a team that's going to lose? So
Fair. Very fair.
I am brutally honest. So whatever.
I like it. I appreciate brutal honesty. That was funny. Um, so moving back into Milledgeville, Dr. Offerman has asked us to ask all of our narrators about Flannery O'Connor. So how aware of Flannery O'Connor's work and life were you in the late 50s to 60s?
Not a lot. Um, my mom uh, had a Cub Scout unit and had me go as one of the older, you know, past Cub Scout age. Uh, I guess associate leaders or something, to Flannery O'Connor's estate over there at Andalusia, and she was in very, very ill health. Um, I remember there were peacocks on the ground, um, and they would occasionally, spread out their feathers, and it was impressive. And the peacock calls are terrifying. Uh, and so they would have that, but there was some sort of associate or assistant of Flannery O'Connor who showed us around because she was too ill to do it herself. And part of the estate was in terrible disrepair. And we went into one area, and they were uh, refining cane into sugar, and it was very primitive, but you could get the feel of boiling the syrup up into sugar, and it had that very strong, sweet but kind of pungent smell to it. And then we went into this area that must have been an old barn or something, and there were books scattered around, just random books scattered around. And the associate said, that Ms. O'Connor said, you could have any of these you want because we're just going to throw them away. And I picked up one, and I still have it to this day. It was the first edition, Edgar Allan Poe. It's an amazing. And I remember I was a big fan of Poe at the time. I was heavily into Robert Louis Stevenson, Edgar Allan Poe, even Bram Stoker. During the period of time I was in the seventh grade, everybody used to talk about, they were into monster movies, as they called them then, because you had Friday night uh, old scary movies that would come on TV. But I wanted to read the real book, so I read Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley, and Robert Louis Stevenson and people like that. I read the original books, the original stories, and I picked up Edgar Allan Poe, and boy, was I hooked. And his books were so amazing, the way that he would describe things. And here I had one in Flannery O'Connor's barn that was one of the original editions. And it still thrills me to think about it. Because of the influence that he had. Frankly, it wasn't until my freshman year at Georgia Tech that they made me read anything by Flannery O'Connor. The high school didn't cover her stuff. They didn't have it. They made us, read the usual stuff, the William Shakespeare and uh, the, the Samuel L. Clemens and things that you would expect like that. No Flannery O'Connor. And I was not introduced to her until I went to college. And I remember the stories about the man who stole the leg from the young woman that had an artificial leg, and the story about the parrot that was ascending to heaven and that represented the Holy Spirit to her. These stories were just weird, just so disturbingly weird. And yet they weren't frightening like when you read Edgar Allan Poe, or even if you read Arthur Conan Doyle, some of those stories were pretty frightening. But Flannery O'Connor's was just something so unique and off, and you could hear the accents as you're reading how she would write them into her story. That didn't seem unnatural to me, but when you're in a place like Georgia Tech, and a lot of students have come from New Jersey or Ohio or maybe even from India or China, but they don't get it. And so you're reading it and it seems, yeah, okay, I heard that when I was growing up. Now nobody in the class ever asked me what it really sounded like. A long time ago, lost that accent, uh, but it was very interesting to read that.
That is an amazing book to find in her barn.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of those classic like monster and horror stories myself. Um, it looks like Zoom says we only have like 7 minutes left before it's going to try and kick us off again. So,
Okay.
closing like two questions.
Okay.
What is one of your most memorable experience that you had in Milledgeville,
Um,
or just one of them, if
yeah.
you need help narrowing it down a little bit, or do you have too many?
I I think one of the most memorable experiences was being there during the centennial observance of the Civil War, and they celebrated Milledgeville's secession from the United States, which I look back on it now and I think that's one of the most perverted things that anybody could have done. But they had fireworks and they had celebrations and they had bands and we went over particularly to GMC where they had this big celebration and they would have speakers who would talk about the history of it, all white, just white. And so I remember a lot about that and I look back on it with sadness. And another question?
Yeah, that is a really strange thing to celebrate, I feel like.
Yeah.
Uh, my final question for you, Dr. Webster, is who else should we talk to? Is there anybody that you know of that you think would be good for future classes to interview?
Yes. One of my best friends in high school was Judge Phil Spivey. Have you talked to him? Okay. He and I were classmates from the first grade all the way through the 12th. And so we know each other really well. We're still friends. We're still Trekkies. Love love Star Trek. Um, he would be able to give you some interesting insights because his mother was a fifth grade teacher at City Elementary. And another one is James Minter, who went on to Columbia University. And after he graduated from Columbia, he worked at Columbia University in New York for quite a while. So he's going to give you some interesting viewpoints too.
Thank you very much for those suggestions. I'm sure Dr. Ackerman will write those down and reach out to them if she
Okay.
hasn't already. I don't know.
Okay. All right. Good.
But
You could blame, you could tell her to blame me for suggesting them.
I will keep that in mind.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Webster. I really
Okay.
appreciate it. I'm very honored that I got to interview you today and
Thank
very
you,
happy that
Uncle
I got
Frank.
paired with you. You're very interesting. I really love listening to you talk,
Thank
and
you very much.
corresponding with you through email was very nice as well.
Okay. Well,
Right.
you got to meet with what Auburn used to call the mouth of the South. I was a senator there for a while. I'm outspoken. So,
I appreciate that you told some very good stories. I'm very
okay.
honored to have been able to hear them.
We hope you enjoyed learning more about the people and historical events connected to Milledgeville and Flannery O'Connor in this episode. If you or someone you know has stories to share related to either of these topics, we'd love to hear them. In addition to documenting community memories, you'll also help us preserve your story for future generations. Visit our website, collectingthepastmilledgeville.wordpress.com, to learn more.